I never imagined a single HOA dispute could destroy an entire neighborhood. One reckless act, one fire meant to send a message, spiraled out of control. By the time the smoke cleared, my cabin was gone, her house was gone, and so were dozens of others. Everyone wanted to know how one HOA board member lit the match that burned everything down. I still remember the exact moment the smell of smoke stopped being someone else's problem. It was early evening, the kind of quiet mountain dusk where sound carries too far and silence feels heavy. My cabin sat at the edge of the HOA-controlled neighborhood, half swallowed by pines, deliberately distant from the manicured lawns and clipboard tyranny down the hill. I'd built it to escape people like her. The HOA president who treated the bylaws like divine law and anyone outside her authority like an infestation. I was inside rinsing a coffee mug when the air shifted. At first it was subtle, an acrid bite beneath the clean pine scent. Then the smoke alarm chirped once, hesitated, and screamed. I stepped onto the porch and froze. Flames licked the far side of my cabin, climbing the dry-wood siding like they'd been invited. Orange light reflected in the windows, dancing, hungry. For a split second, my brain refused to catch up. Fires happened to other people. Fires happened on the news. Then I saw her. She stood at the edge of my property line, arms crossed, her face illuminated by the glow. Late 40s, immaculately dressed even out here. White jacket, pristine boots that had never touched dirt. Her lips were tight, eyes wide, not with fear but with something else. Satisfaction. I shouted her name. My voice cracked, raw and disbelieving. She didn't move, didn't run, didn't call for help. She turned and walked away. That was the moment everything changed. I grabbed the extinguisher, knowing it wouldn't be enough. The wind had picked up, pushing the fire along the roofline. Dry season. Dead needles everywhere. A perfect storm waiting for one spark, one intentional spark, to explode. By the time I dialed 911, embers were already drifting toward the neighboring lots. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm, rehearsed, while my world began to burn. Fire trucks arrived fast, but not fast enough. The flames jumped from my cabin to the brush, from brush to fence, from fence to the first house in the HOA's precious row of identical homes. Sirens cut through the night. People poured out in pajamas and panic, clutching phones and pets, screaming questions no one could answer. And suddenly she was back, screaming too. "This is your fault," she shrieked, pointing at me as firefighters dragged hoses past us. He ignored HOA regulations. He refused inspections. I warned him. Her voice cracked, not with guilt but with rage. Rage that the fire hadn't stayed contained, rage that consequences had escaped the boundaries she thought she controlled. I stared at her, soot-streaked, hands shaking, my cabin collapsing behind me. "You said it," I said, barely louder than the crackle of burning timber. She laughed. Actually laughed. "Prove it." By midnight, 3 houses were gone. By dawn, the neighborhood looked like a war zone, blackened frames, smoking ruins, ash drifting like snow. The HOA president stood wrapped in a blanket, telling anyone who would listen that this was what happened when rules weren't followed. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known in that moment, was that I'd already documented everything. The first time I realized something was seriously wrong, it wasn't the fire, it was the smell. Pine cabins always have a scent of their own. Sap, damp wood, cold air rolling down from the ridge. That morning, though, there was something sharp underneath it, like burnt plastic mixed with gasoline. I noticed it when I stepped outside with my coffee, staring at the frost still clinging to the railing. The air felt tense, unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My cabin sat on the edge of an HOA-controlled development that pretended to be rustic living. Log-style homes, narrow roads, strict rules about everything from roof color to how long you could leave a truck parked outside. I had fought the HOA from day one. They hated that my cabin predated their authority. I hated that they acted like they owned the mountain. And leading that charge was Karen. That wasn't her real name, but it fit her perfectly. Late 40s, expensive boots that had never touched mud, clipboard always tucked under her arm like a weapon. She lived 3 cabins down and took it personally that mine didn't follow community standards. I'd received warnings for firewood stacked too high, for smoke from my chimney lingering too long, even for having an old metal fire pit that existed before the HOA did. 2 weeks before the fire, she'd come onto my property uninvited. I was fixing a cracked window frame when I heard her voice, sharp and nasal, calling my name like she was summoning a misbehaving child. She stood at the edge of my porch, arms crossed, eyes scanning my cabin with open disgust. "This place is a hazard," she said without greeting. "Your wiring, your stove, that fire pit, you're endangering the entire neighborhood." I told her she was trespassing. She laughed. "When your negligence burns us all down, I'll remind you of this conversation." I reported her to the HOA board. Nothing happened. I filed a written complaint about harassment. Ignored. A week later, I found a violation notice nailed to my door, for hostile behavior toward HOA leadership. That's when I installed cameras. The second warning sign came 3 nights before the fire. One of my motion sensors triggered at 2:13 a.m. The footage showed a shadow moving near my woodpile, just outside the camera's range. No face, no clear figure, just movement and the faint glint of something reflective. I sent the clip to the HOA board with a message: "Someone is on my property at night. If something happens, this is on record." Their response came the next morning: "Probably wildlife. Stop escalating." The night of the fire was dry. Too dry. Winter had been unusually warm, and the forest floor was a carpet of dead needles and brittle leaves. I'd left earlier that afternoon to restock supplies in town, planning to return before sunset. I never made it back. At 6:47 p.m., my phone exploded with alert. Motion detected. Heat spike. Camera offline. Then the calls started. By the time I reached the roadblock, flames were already climbing the trees behind my cabin, jumping from roof to roof like something alive. Fire engines screamed past me, headlights cutting through thick, choking smoke. I could see my place, or what was left of it, through the haze. The roof had collapsed inward, embers spraying into the wind. A firefighter grabbed my arm and pushed me back. "You can't go in there." I wasn't trying to save the cabin. I was staring at the source. The fire hadn't started deep in the woods. It had started right beside my cabin, near the woodpile, near the spot where my camera had caught that shadow, near the same place Karen had pointed to when she called my home a hazard. As the fire spread downhill, panic ripped through the neighborhood. Sirens blended with screams. Families ran with whatever they could carry. And somewhere in the chaos, I saw Karen, standing barefoot on the road, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the inferno with a look that wasn't just fear. It was shock. Like someone who never believed the match would actually catch. The investigators arrived before the smoke had fully cleared. Red and blue lights cut through the gray dawn as fire marshals, state officials, and insurance reps descended on what used to be a quiet mountain development. Yellow tape went up. Clipboards came out. And suddenly, the HOA that loved paperwork so much didn't have nearly enough answers. I stood where my front door had been, boots sinking into warm ash. Every step uncovered something familiar and ruined: twisted nails, half-melted tools, the warped outline of my wood stove. My cameras were gone, but the metal mount where one had been bolted to the cabin wall still clung there, blackened but intact. The fire marshal, a woman with soot-streaked sleeves and tired eyes, crouched near the woodpile remains. "This is where it started," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "That's what I've been saying." She poked through debris with a metal rod. Accelerant patterns all wrong for an accident. Fire didn't spread outward naturally, it jumped. "Meaning?" I asked. She looked up at me. "Meaning someone helped it." Word spread fast. By mid-morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Some blamed faulty wiring. Others blamed lightning, even though the sky had been clear for days. The HOA board gathered near their still-standing office, whispering in tight circles like frightened birds. Karen was nowhere to be seen. I didn't have to look far to find her later. She sat on the back bumper of an emergency truck, hair unbrushed, designer coat replaced with a borrowed sweatshirt. Her hands shook as she held a paper cup of coffee. When she saw me approaching, her eyes widened, then hardened. "This is on you," she snapped, standing up too fast. "Your death trap cabin." "Stop," the fire marshal said sharply, stepping between us. "Ma'am, you need to come with me." Karen froze. "Why?" "We have questions." I watched as her confidence drained away with every step she took toward the investigator's tent. This was the same woman who once threatened fines because my porch light was too yellow. Now she couldn't even meet my eyes. By noon, the preliminary report was circulating quietly among officials. Suspected arson. That's when I remembered the cloud backup. My cameras automatically uploaded footage when they detected motion. Even if the devices themselves were destroyed, anything recorded before the fire would still exist. I borrowed a laptop from a friend and logged in. There it was, 2 nights before the fire. Timestamp, 2:11 a.m. The footage was clearer than I remembered. A figure stepped into frame this time, close enough for the infrared to catch details. A woman, medium height, hood pulled up, gloves on her hands. She moved with purpose, not caution, carrying a small red container. She stopped by the woodpile. She poured. The camera caught her face when she turned, just for a second. Long enough. Karen. My stomach dropped, not from shock but from the weight of what came next. I handed the footage to the investigators within the hour. Everything changed. Police cars returned. Not just to the ruins, but to Karen's house, one of the few still standing. Neighbors gathered behind tape as officers knocked. Then waited. Then knocked again. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, eyes darting wildly. She screamed when they cuffed her. Screamed that it was an accident. That she was just trying to scare me. That she never thought the fire would spread. That the HOA would protect her. They didn't. As more evidence surfaced, texts, prior complaints, ignored warnings, the narrative collapsed. The HOA board released a statement distancing themselves from her actions. Emails leaked showing they dismissed multiple reports about her behavior. Lawyers circled like vultures. And the neighborhood? It turned on itself. Families who'd lost homes demanded accountability. Insurance companies refused to pay without answers. Lawsuits stacked up. The HOA, once so proud of its authority, was suddenly fighting for survival. By the next morning, the neighborhood no longer felt like a place where people lived. It felt like a crime scene that just happened to have mailboxes. The air still smelled like burned wood and melted plastic, a bitter reminder that what started as a petty HOA dispute had turned into something irreversible. Yellow caution tape crisscrossed the streets, and fire trucks sat idle like exhausted beasts that had arrived too late to stop the damage. My cabin was nothing but a blackened shell. The roof had collapsed inward, and the windows were blown out, leaving jagged glass embedded in the dirt. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the wreckage, trying to process how one deliberate act could erase years of work in a single night. This wasn't an accident. Everyone knew that now. The fire marshal approached me with a clipboard, his expression grim but controlled. He explained that the fire had been intentionally set at the rear of my cabin, right near the propane storage area, an area I'd repeatedly warned the HOA about after they forced me to move equipment closer to the structure. When the flames hit the propane tanks, the explosion carried embers across the dry tree line and into neighboring properties. That was when the situation went from bad to catastrophic. Within minutes, the fire jumped from my cabin to the adjacent homes. Wind pushed the flames like a living thing, feeding them faster than firefighters could contain them. By the time the first engine arrived, the blaze had already crossed 3 properties. By the time more help showed up, it was too late. And at the center of it all was her. The same HOA board member who had fined me for unauthorized exterior modifications. The same woman who'd accused me of violating community aesthetic. Witnesses came forward almost immediately. One neighbor said they saw her near my cabin just before the fire started. Another reported smelling gasoline. Someone else mentioned she'd been ranting earlier that week about teaching me a lesson. The police didn't need long to connect the dots. She was taken in for questioning that afternoon. As news spread, shock turned into anger. Families who had lost their homes demanded answers. Parents who barely got their kids out in time wanted accountability. The HOA board, so loud and aggressive just days earlier, suddenly went silent. Phones stopped being answered. Emails went unread. Their authority evaporated the moment the truth surfaced. What stunned everyone most wasn't just that she set the fire, it was why. According to investigators, she believed burning my cabin would scare me into dropping a legal complaint I'd filed against the HOA for harassment and unsafe enforcement policies. She thought it would be quick, contain, a warning. Instead, it became one of the worst residential fires the area had ever seen. That night, local news vans lined the road. Reporters asked the same question over and over: how could something like this happen in a managed community? The answer was painfully simple: unchecked power mixed with entitlement and zero accountability. As the investigation deepened, more ugly details emerged. The HOA had ignored multiple fire safety violations. They'd dismissed warnings from residents. They'd fined people who raised concerns. And when one of their own crossed the line into criminal behavior, there was no system in place to stop her. By the end of the week, charges were filed: arson, reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and more. Lawsuits followed immediately. Insurance companies launched their own investigations. The HOA's legal team resigned. The board disbanded under pressure from residents who wanted nothing to do with the organization anymore. The morning after the fire didn't feel real. The air still smelled like wet ash and melted plastic, a sour reminder that everything familiar had been reduced to debris overnight. I stood behind the yellow tape with dozens of others, staring at what used to be an entire neighborhood. Homes were nothing more than blackened frames. Cars sat half-buried in snow and soot, their paint blistered beyond recognition. It looked less like a suburb and more like a war zone. Fire investigators moved carefully from lot to lot, photographing, measuring, marking. Every few minutes, one of them would stop, shake their head, and jot something down. I already knew what they were finding. I'd warned the HOA for months that the cabins and homes were packed too tightly, that dead trees hadn't been cleared, that the fire breaks required by county code didn't exist. They'd ignored every report, fined me for unauthorized complaints, and told me to stop stirring panic. Now the panic was everywhere. Karen stood across the street, wrapped in a blanket, mascara streaked down her face. The woman who once strutted through meetings with a smug smile and a rulebook tucked under her arm looked small now. Broken. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't issuing threats or talking about fines. She just stared at the ruins like she couldn't process how fast her authority had turned to ash. By noon, the police interviews began. They talked to everyone: homeowners, firefighters, HOA board members. When it was my turn, I handed over a thick folder I'd kept for years. Emails, certified letters, inspection reports, photos of dry brush piled against homes, notices from the county that were never acted on. The officer flipped through it slowly, his expression hardening with each page. "You sent all of this?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "And they responded with fines?" He nodded once and closed the folder. "That changes things." Word spread quickly. By the afternoon, lawyers were everywhere. Insurance adjusters followed, their faces pale as they calculated losses that climbed into the tens of millions. Families who had defended the HOA for years suddenly remembered voting against safety budget. Board members who had rubber-stamped every bad decision stopped answering their phones. And Karen? She was taken aside just before sunset. No one announced it. No sirens. Just two investigators speaking quietly with her while she shook her head over and over again. When they escorted her toward an unmarked car, the crowd went silent. This wasn't about revenge. It was accountability finally catching up. The investigation confirmed what the firefighters already suspected. The initial fire had been small, containable. But it spread with terrifying speed because of everything the HOA had refused to address. Unmaintained fire lanes, locked emergency access gates, combustible fencing, and a complete lack of defensible space. One spark became an inferno because negligence had been policy. In the weeks that followed, lawsuits piled up. The HOA was dissolved under court order. Every board member was named personally in civil suit. Insurance refused to cover gross negligence. Karen's name appeared in headlines she could no longer control. Standing among the ashes, I realized something sobering. This wasn't just about my cabin. It was about how quickly things collapse when authority goes unchallenged and warnings are ignored. One spark, one decision, one person convinced they were untouchable, and an entire neighborhood paid the price. The fire destroyed buildings, but it also burned away illusions. No one saw the HOA the same way again. And as the smoke finally cleared, one truth remained undeniable. This didn't have to happen, but someone made sure it did. As for me, I lost my cabin. Years of memories gone in a single night. But I also gained something I hadn't expected: validation. Neighbors I'd argued with for years came to me quietly, apologizing. Some hugged me. Others just said, "You tried to warn us. Rebuilding will take years. Some families will never return." But changes came fast. New regulations, real inspections, mandatory safety clearances enforced by the county, not an HOA drunk on power. The system that failed us so badly was finally being corrected. Too late for many, but not for those who would come next. Sometimes people ask if I feel satisfied. I don't. I feel tired. I feel sad. And I feel angry that it took total destruction for common sense to matter. This wasn't karma or poetic justice. It was preventable loss caused by arrogance and control disguised as community standards. If there's one thing I learned, it's this: warnings matter. Paper trails matter. And when people in power silence those warnings to protect their ego, the cost isn't just measured in fines or lawsuits. It's measured in lives upended and neighborhoods erased. I stood on the ridge that evening, watching the sun dip behind charred trees. The land was quiet again, but it felt different, exposed. Honest. Karen's mistake wasn't starting the fire. It was believing she could control it. And as the first criminal charges were filed, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything burning down. The fire is out, but the lesson is still burning.